Hello, hello! Welcome back to Loki's Librarian. I am the librarian Katrina. If you are new here, welcome. This is where I am reading through the enormous library of books you see behind me with my giant squid sitting in the corner. It's the holidays, had to clear up couch space downstairs for visiting family, so the squid's in my office for now. I'm mentioning that because I have friends with very sick minds, and so I need to let everybody know that that is not what you might think it is. It's a squid. Then I give you a quick synopsis of what I just read, and I tell you what I think about it. So if you like books and just aren't sure what to read next, hit that subscribe button, like and share my videos, let me know what you think in the comments. Now, this week's book is Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World by Johanna Katrin Fredriksdottir. And this joined my library in the same binge shopping as last month's book on Harold Hardrada. You know, I don't just go to a website and go, I'm going to buy that one book. I'm going to browse through their entire book section and buy what I can at, in one go. And then because I started adding booze to my books a few weeks ago, this cocktail this week is appropriately enough called Valkyrie, which will be mixed while I review the book, so let's jump into this. I'm going to kind of give you a breakdown chapter by chapter. There's only 6 chapters in the book, and I'll kind of go for what I like and didn't like about the book and or chapter in question, because I don't want this to be like this 2-hour-long drawn-out saga. And each chapter basically covers a life cycle of a human, in this case focusing on women, which makes sense given the title of the book, and starts with infancy and childhood. Now, right, real quick, you guys know I have a cocktail shaker. You saw it in my one, I think, on Amityville. I can't find it. I can't find it. For the love of God, I can't find the damn thing. I know I still have it, but I couldn't tell you where. So I'm using a blender bottle instead. I'm sure it works. We'll see. The first chapter on infancy and childhood explores the fact that life as a Viking was hard, which makes sense, right? It was 1,000 years ago. They didn't have modern medicine. And while children were certainly a blessing, life was hard, right? And children were certainly a blessing, but they may not have always been a welcome one, as children were, there were more mouths to feed. And for the first couple of years, they're not doing anything productive on the farm. They're not helping to run anything. They're not helping with the weaving or the, feeding the animals. They're just there, they're not doing anything. So we start with 2 ounces of Absolut vodka. Oh, I'm sorry. It says Absolut vodka. It actually says vanilla vodka. They didn't have vanilla vodka at the store. I just do the shopping at the grocery store. So I went with Smirnoffs because they had the vanilla Smirnoffs at the store. 2 ounces of vanilla vodka. I have to try flavored vodkas more often. I've never really had a flavored vodka. That's not bad. While sons were invariably welcome and daughters were certainly useful around the homestead, they were also problematic in that daughters had to be provided with a dowry upon marriage. That's not different from anywhere else in Europe. Literally everywhere else in Europe, this was the exact same thing. Daughters had to have a dowry. I don't know why. That's just how it was back then. And she kind of floats the idea of infanticide being a possible practice, which, if you've ever seen the movie 300, you're aware that infanticide happened if a family thought, at least in the Spartans, right? If a child was deformed, they would chuck it out to the wolves, basically. And that's apparently, I don't know that it was common, and she doesn't either. She does say, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but there were reports from extant sources of infanticide happening. It's not specified if girls were singled out over boys for infanticide, but the author sort of hints that it's her belief because patriarchy. Yes, it's always because of the patriarchy. And she argues that it was such an embedded custom among Scandinavian people that when the conversion to Christianity happened, multiple laws against infanticide had to be passed, which literally flies in the face of every other pagan people who encountered Christianity. Typically, women were among the first to embrace the new cult of Christianity, and at the time it was considered a cult. It wasn't quite the organized religion, right? But it was specifically because Christianity forbade infanticide. So while it's possible that Scandinavian women were more dedicated to their gods than their children, that indicates a level of cold-bloodedness that I just don't know what to do with from a historical perspective. And I don't think I buy it. Because while there are certainly indications in the mythos that I've read that they had sacrifices, like even including human sacrifices, it was usually adult males who were sacrificed, not children. So I actually don't think the Norse gods called for sacrificing children. I think it was if infanticide happened, it was more a practical matter of this child is, malformed, he was born, missing a limb or clearly unable to move or function in a normal society. And so rather than have him be a drain on the household and society in general, they would just expose him to the elements. Don't know if it ever happened. Don't know if it's true. Just going off of some excellent sources who indicate it, and given those sources were probably biased, especially if they were reporting about the time between the conversion, then of course sacrificing your children in such a fashion would be seen as completely heathen and pagan and bad, and we're trying to get you into the Christian side, so who knows. Now, okay, what's my next one? Half fluid ounce of grapefruit juice. Could not find a smaller bottle of grapefruit juice, so I have this absolutely enormous thing of grapefruit juice. I hope I like it. I've never had just grapefruit juice, and if it sucks, I'm about to waste a whole ton of it, because we only need a ½ ounce, and I couldn't find, oh my god, a ½ ounce is freaking tiny. ½ ounce out of that entire enormous thing. Like I said, I hope it's good. Don't know if infanticide was actually done. Now, one of the resources she pulls from is the Grey Goose laws. I'm probably mispronouncing that. The translation is basically Grey Goose laws, which were Icelandic laws in the 13th century that covered everyone, including women. I'm not sure if I agree with her interpretation of those laws and how they were applied. She seems to think that while they were there, they weren't really applied. Maybe, I don't know. She does point out that there are limited resources on what childhood would have been like, which I get. I mean, infant mortality rates in the Middle Ages were between 40 and 60%. And since you could be married as young as 12 or 13 and were considered a full adult capable of inheriting at 16, they likely didn't have much of a childhood. And what they did have was probably spent learning on how to adult, because you didn't have long to grow up and learn how to be an adult. Now, the next chapter was on teenage girls, which is natural enough calling for us. Problem being, teenagers didn't really exist as a concept or a group until, I don't think that needs to be shaken up, until the 1940s. So literally 1,000 years ago, you were a child or you were an adult. There was no in-between stage. Remember, 12 or 13, you were eligible to marry, and that was completely common back then. Not just among the Scandinavians. I mean everywhere. That was standard. You started menses and you were an adult. You were eligible for marriage at that point. There was no in-between phase. But Frederick's daughter covers it separately, so here's what was in that next chapter. ½ ounce of vanilla syrup. You shake all this together. Okay, that's on. And then you pour it over crushed ice, mostly crushed ice. The cocktail's made. We'll start sipping that from here on out. Now, basically, if you were a teenage girl, you were screwed. At least according to Frederick's daughter. By the patriarchy and the matriarchy. You could actually be equally screwed by both of your parents, since female guardians could be just as cutthroat in securing marriage for their daughters. And this chapter is kind of where she really starts to lose me. Teenage years, such as they were, are when boys would have been gone out to make their mark as fighters, okay? So if such a thing existed, like a shield maiden, so would girls. Now, I don't know if shield maidens actually existed 1,000 years ago in the Viking culture. I am at least willing to entertain the thought. Frederick's daughter does not. And while I kind of see the point she's trying to make, in as much as I think that the big grave marking was the Burkish grave. There was a mass grave found in the early 20th century. One of the bodies was surrounded by weapons and everything, and so everybody's like, oh wow, it's a huge Viking warrior find. And then 100 years later they did a DNA analysis, found out it was actually a girl. And now all of a sudden there's no such thing. It couldn't possibly have been a female fighter. And she bases it on the bones were not dense enough to have been a fighter. And okay, I buy that, because that's actual science. That's believable. Or it's possible that she was in training for it and died before she could actually develop the bone density. But that idea isn't explored. But what kills me is that she didn't just shoot it down as mundane science. She shoots it down as girls who would have fought would have identified as boys, being transgendered. I swear to God, I rolled my eyes so hard I almost went blind. Especially when she, in the very next chapter, contradicts herself and says that girls who did go off to fight would have given up the sword in the 20s to become a mother. Now, the book I read back in July, Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, I'll include a link to that one in the description. Gender dysphoria is a thing, which Abigail Schreier certainly acknowledges, and all the science out there says, yes, gender dysphoria is a thing. Like, that's a true medical condition, and you don't just get over it, all right? to decide that you were a real girl after all. Basically, everybody who's doing that now, everybody who in their teenagers transition and are suddenly real girls, it was part of a fad, and they're recognizing that, and they're recognizing that they were suckered into it. And there's a bunch of detransitioning videos, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent on that, but gender dysphoria is a real thing, and you don't just get over it to decide, okay, yeah, I do want to be a mother. That's part of what that irreversible damage was. Back to this book. Gender dysphoria as a medical condition, now understand, it probably has been around for several thousand years. I think Blair White mentioned something about it being recorded as far back as Mesopotamia. I don't know about that. I haven't done that research. But as far as a described medical condition, it's probably about as new as psychotherapy, which is only about 140 years old. Now, having said that, the Norse were probably better equipped for the concept than most cultures, given that there are stories in their mythos about gods gender swapping. There are 3 such stories that I am aware. 2 of them involve Loki being Loki, meaning a trickster's gonna trick. That's what they do. God love him. That is what they do. They are tricksters. They live their life to trick people, places, and things. Grand. The 3rd one mentioned, which is mentioned in the book, probably not the transgender defense Frederick's daughter wanted to go for. I'm pretty sure she was defending the concept as solid for millennia because, per her biography, she was educated at Harvard and taught, among other things, gender studies at Yale. God, American colleges ruin everything. I mean, seriously. All right, here's the story. So Odin hears a prophecy that a princess named Rinda is destined to bear him a son. So he uses the runic magic to make her go mad, then disguises himself as a woman to gain access to her where he rapes her. So, dude dressing as a woman to gain access to a woman-only spaces for the purpose of sexual assault. I am positive that is not the takeaway that she meant people to get from that. I'm just positive that's not what she meant to say. But for all that, she does go into other career paths that women could have and that are documented. So they could be scalds or poets. A scald is a Norse poet, basically. So they could be scalds, they could be rune masters, they could run their own businesses, generally in textiles, and of course they could be a vulva or a seeress, all right, basically magic, right? And once they were married, women typically had a bit more agency. Now, let's try this. It's kind of a vaguely sour, sweet taste. I don't know. I mean, I'll drink it, but I don't know. I'm not sure if I like this one. Once they were married, women typically had a bit more agency, although Frederick's daughter does everything she can to disprove that because, of course, the patriarchy. So the examples she pulls from are largely the Icelandic sagas, which is logical. Those were the best possible resources to try and construct a time from 1,000 years ago. And even they are outdated, having been written anywhere from 100 to 300 years after the incidents or the stories they are purported to be reporting on now. They were also written during a time when the conversion to Christianity had been completed. And since 1,000 years ago, that was when the conversion was just starting, we don't really know what impact the Norse gods would have had on some of these stories, okay? And if, the Norse gods are probably slightly downplayed, but I don't know, I haven't actually read the sagas yet, so I'm basically stuck with her interpretations of it. And mostly the sagas are mentioning women who are highborn. And hey, we all like to think about princesses being in positions of power, but in one of history's greatest inversions, the higher placed you were socially back then, the less freedom and power you actually had. So, I mean, who's to say there were not, in fact, shield maidens? And more on that a bit later. The next chapter addresses adulthood, married life, and a divorce. Yep, divorce. Because that was one right Viking women absolutely had. The right to get out of a shitty marriage. Yeah, I don't think I'm digging this one. Once you were married, when the marriage ended, either through death or divorce, you had a bit more agency. Unless you were rich or royalty. I can chalk one up for peasant happiness. And what's interesting in this book, not necessarily this chapter, although it could be in this chapter. Well, actually, it's not, because I found the note later. It's in the later adult on being widowhood, actually. But she does talk about one of the ships that rolled out of Iceland heading towards Iceland? It may have been Iceland. It might have been Norway. But one of the ships that rolled out for colonization, on the ship's rolls were found 13 single women. And they were actually granted farms on their own right when the ship landed. You know, that would have been unheard of in some of the other European cultures. So it is kind of cool that single women were granted passage and allowed to farm their own land without the help of a man. But she kind of downplays that. It's kind of a throwaway line. That's why it stuck out so much in my head. And if they ended up being a skald, rune master, or craftsman after their marriage, after their divorce or whatever, they certainly had the ability and agency to travel and make a living doing such. She did mention, interestingly enough, that there were laws against transvestitism, which is wearing clothes of the other gender, which would mean that if there were shield maidens, they had to be bloody damn good to get away with it. Also means that the Vikings definitely understood evolutionary biology. Something that humanity has known for millions of years, up until about a decade ago when we all got very confused about science.
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Thanks for the tip.
Anyway, she does mention the fact of concubinage, which we learned about in the Harold Hardrada book. However, man taking a concubine was not actually reason for divorce, provided he did not also abandon the marital bed. So as long as he's stooping them both, we're all golden. And there are 4 commonly used reasons for divorce: marital discord, domestic violence, abandonment of the marital bed, and failure to maintain dependence, basically being a deadbeat dad. Because then she could go out and find somebody else who would support her and her kids. And, anyways. So the next chapter has to do with pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood. And Friedrichsdottir does an excellent job highlighting the value of mothers and motherhood in Scandinavian culture 1,000 years ago, highlighting the importance of family as a unit, and as a means of survival, highlighting stories from the sagas where the mother would intercede for children with their fathers, sometimes stealing weaponry to give to sons before the sons head out on their epic quests. Now, she also points out some of the instances of toxic motherhood, not quite calling them Oedipal mothers, but the idea is definitely there. I mean, I drew the conclusion. And whether there were shield maidens or not, it does seem likely that Viking women were fiercely protective of their children. Chapter 5 has to do with widows, because while women could and certainly did die of a host of issues, they were still more likely to outlive their warrior husbands. I mean, you're going to die in battle, right? And once you were widowed, you were, unless you were very rich or royal, free. You were rich or royal, you were likely to be forced into a remarriage, either by the king or by other family members, both your mother or your father, who were looking to use your status as a wealthy heiress to increase their own social mobility. But in this chapter, Friedrichsdottir moves away from the sagas and highlights 2 real-life widows and their accomplishments, which we know about because they became successful tradesmen, and I'm not using correct language. They became successful tradesmen in their widowhood and left runestones to tell their stories. And apparently they were not psychotic mothers, because their kids also talked about their mothers on runestones. And so that's a remarkable accomplishment. And it was a nice reprieve from the social justice warrior ideology being forced down my throat during this book. Although she couldn't help patronizing the past when discussing runestones left by Sigurður, which depicts part of a saga about slaying of a dragon, she couldn't believe that a woman might have found a story about the exploits of a man interesting enough to memorialize them in such a fashion. Because apparently all women everywhere, anytime, only like Jane Austen. I hate Jane Austen. I think she's boring. That book got way better with zombies. The final chapter is Old Age and Death. And here is where she discusses the Volga, because typically the seers would have been older women with a bit of life experience and the veneration that comes with old age. And this section is where I was most aggravated by her contradictions, because she contradicts herself consistently throughout, applying this double standard of what means what. See, in the chapters on teenagers and motherhood, we had contradictions. So let me explain this contradiction. Chapter on teenagers, Friedrichsdottir explains how there was no way women could have been warriors and still identified as women, right? The most famous grave is that Burka female Viking burial mound. She basically shoves off as male fantasy. I mean, the body was real. The sword in the grave was certainly real. But she goes into great length of detail on how the girl could not have been a warrior despite the presence of the sword, and how burial rites are for the living, and the goods buried with her probably denoted status, and not the belief that she would actually wield the sword or would actually use it. Then in the chapter on motherhood, she discusses a young boy who was also buried with a warrior kit and says, quote, "One wonders whether the young boys buried with a complete kit were sent to the afterlife with the weapons that their mother had intended to give them when they came of age had they lived." End quote. So, why is it so impossible to believe that the sword was buried with the girl for the same reason? I mean, I swear to God, there is no more bigoted, misogynistic, racist group of people on this mudball planet called Earth than your average leftist. And as a final nail in the coffin of stupidity in this final chapter on old age and death, she highlights several burial mounds of women, including the famous Oseberg burial mound, where the women were absolutely buried with items they would have used in the afterlife, like, weights and measures if they were tradesmen, spindles if they were, spinners and weavers and textiles. So which is it? They were buried with stuff they'd use, or burial rites are for the living? You don't get to have it both ways. You're contradicting yourself, and it makes it very frustrating. So I like parts of the book. Cocktail's not growing on me. It was not awesome. I liked parts of the book. I think there was some good history in here when the author pulled her own head out enough to get her out of her own way. She could actually make some good points. I did find some of her references to the sagas confusing, because she would mention the same sagas but different parts in different chapters to try and prove her point. Now, she would cross-reference. She'd say, see chapter 2 for more on this particular thing. But I don't want to have to flip back and forth to see the whole point she's making. And also, among the other contradictions she has is she cherry picks which sagas she wants to pull from, discounting some, like the ones with all the shield maidens in them, because it's heroic myth and they fight dragons there. But then from those same heroic myths, she'll choose to believe a story about a woman who used rune magic to protect herself and her family. So again, which is it? The myths are either totally awesome in there and you believe everything, including shield maidens, or you believe none of it, meaning that a woman using runic magic to protect herself is garbage. You don't get to have it both ways. So it's very frustrating. It's very frustrating. All the contradictions are embarrassing and inherently confusing, and you can tell she's pushing an agenda, and history doesn't really have an agenda. It is what it is. Now, you can pull up new facts about history, which is what Jack Weatherford did with his Genghis Khan book, but saying that the parts you disagree with are absolute bullshit, but the parts you like are cool is no. There are definitely problems with this book. I'm a bit disappointed in it. Since I haven't read the sagas, I do have to basically trust her interpretation, which I'm loath to do because she went full retard on the gender study stuff.
Everybody knows you never go full retard.
So I kind of feel like, I do have the book. I have it. I don't know if this is all the sagas, but the Sagas of the Icelanders, I do have this book, but it's not one that I could do as like a book of the week because it's a conglomeration, or it's a stockpile of each saga. So there's like 15 sagas in here, 15 stories. So I feel like those would need to be like read a story and explain it, and I don't want to necessarily do that as one a month or one a week or whatever, because that would take a huge chunk. But maybe I'll try and work in mythos somewhere else. Maybe I'll do a second day where I just do a myth. I don't know. Anyways, that's a tangent. I'll figure that out later. Back to this week's book. So some of the history was good, if a little confusing in how it's explained. And also, it wasn't so much history as speculation. Stupid speculation. Millions of years of evolution, and we're now stumped by...
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
I dislike the perpetual harping on the patriarchy because, duh. Fuck. Women contributed, but sorry, men built a huge chunk of the planet, so what are you going to do? And she also seemed genuinely surprised that rape was such a thing 1,000 years ago. Water is wet, trees are green. Rape has pretty much been a part of life since cavemen. It's just always been there. Does it suck? Yes, it does. But it's only in the last decade, the same decade where we all got stupid about gender, that we stopped teaching women that they could, in fact, protect themselves. And we turn it from protecting yourself and having your own agency to just teach boys not to rape. Well, how many women do you think actually tell their sons, yes, rape is okay? I'm betting none. I'm betting there are 0 women on this planet who teach their sons that is okay. Yeah, 0 women say that. People are shit. All right. Sometimes they're just shitty humans out there, and you have to be prepared to defend yourself from them. I mean, Christ, we all know I love Genghis Khan, but there was no way he engendered, 1% of the world's population with his DNA through entirely voluntary interaction. And the fact that rape was so prevalent in the sagas contributes to my belief that, that was pretty much par for the course in the Middle Ages. And of course, the 21st century political gender ideology being forced on 1,000-year-old history is not a happy pairing. It does not work. I mean, it's so blatantly obvious an ideology that's being pushed. I mean, I am, as of finishing this book, convinced that Vikings were smarter than your average Harvard-trained gender studies teacher of history. Because at least they knew...
Boys have a penis, girls have a vagina.
Out of the mouths of babes. I was disappointed in this one. I really wanted to like it. I was really hopeful. And I'm disappointed because she couldn't stop pushing her agenda. And that's it for this week. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to comment, and I will see you all next week. Bye.